Okay. Welcome, everyone. Apologies, my video apparently just stopped, but my name is Leeanne Bond. I have the pleasure of moderating this session this afternoon on the industry category. And I also have the pleasure of being a selector in Queensland and have been a selector since 2015. So we have 4 people today to present, and then we'll follow that with a Q&A session. You can, throughout this session, as a question comes to you, please enter it into the live Q&A tab. There is a discussion forum, but we will be using the Q&A tab, please. All of the 4 presenters, I've just realised I had the pleasure of being on their selection panel, so I'm feeling pretty good about myself, meeting them all, having done their wonderful fellowships. First up, we have Katherine, and her subject is public facilities. Katherine was the recipient of the 2018 Rodney Warmington Churchill Fellowship to increase inclusion and accessibility in public toilets by researching taboos, design, policy, and legal barriers. Between March and May 2019, Katherine travelled to the USA, UK, Ireland, the Netherlands, and Germany, talking toilets. Katherine is a practitioner in social planning and community development, working to address inequality and social injustice. She's worked with a range of government and non-government programs to address social issues and achieve results, including in local and state government, social planning and community development in Australia and the Pacific. Please welcome Katherine Webber.
Thank you, Leeanne, and it's lovely to be here and getting the opportunity to talk toilets again. So the first speaker in this infrastructure session, I have taken it upon myself to teach you all to become public toilet enthusiasts like myself by the end of this session. So we'll see how I go throughout this session. I'd like to be acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm located at the moment, which is the land of the Yagara and Turrbal people. This photo is taken a short walk away from the State Library at West End or Kurilpa, and it is a great, for me, a photo that really connects our public infrastructure to place. And so these are some public toilets that are adorned with a local artist and trying to represent what place and country means to them. And I just, I'm going to share a lot of photos of toilets today, so here we go. So my Churchill Journey, as it was stated, I was awarded the fellowship in 2018 and got to travel in 2019. As you can see in the first image there, I am rugged up in Portland, Oregon. I got to travel and meet the community members as well as the manufacturers of the Portland loo. The community decided they didn't have enough toilets that were the right design that met community need. And so they designed this toilet here, which is unisex, all gender toilets, large enough to take in a wheelchair, a shopping trolley, double pram, whatever luggage that you're traveling with. You've got the ventilation at the top and bottom, so you can see if there's somebody in there, but also no nasty smells get in there. Something a bit different about don't have to worry about here in Australia is that their infrastructure can freeze. So they do need to make sure that they're designing infrastructure for rather cold temperatures. In the middle is me at my award ceremony. We did have an Auslan interpreter, and a highlight was learning how to sign toilet. So flat palm, pointer finger, double tap is a bit chuffed in that image there. And also this year, as part of my Churchill Journey, I participated in the Policy Impact Program. And that was a great opportunity to really think about what my recommendations from my Churchill report were and condense my report into 2,000 words targeted for targeted for from policymakers, and going down to Canberra was a learning experience, and I can talk a little bit more about that as we go through. So why toilets, and what got me interested? So I've worked in local government, I've worked for community organisations, also talked to family and friends, and I started collecting toilets. So experiences where people couldn't participate in an activity or had a really uncomfortable or embarrassing experience because of a toilet. And it took me a couple of years, but I started joining the dots between all these different stories. And so everybody needs to go to the toilet, but we don't always use toilets for what you might think they're used for. So there definitely is the bodily functions that need to happen. People can use them for breastfeeding, for accessing water, for changing clothes, for washing their body, washing clothes, essential medication, drug use. They're places of work as well. So you've got people who do maintenance, clean the toilets. So there's a lot of different intersects with toilets. And so, yeah, there's a lot of different toilet experiences that trying to capture. So through my research as part of the Churchill, I've identified that public toilets are really important. They support physical and mental health. They support, so as an individual, if you're going for a walk in the park, you need to have a public, at some points you need to go. Through COVID, we've definitely learnt the need for public health and the importance of hand washing through public toilets. Public toilets support tourism and economic development. They support the nighttime economy. So if you're out and about after hours, it's really important you can go to the toilet if you need to. And this also supports people who are transport workers, bus drivers, our Uber and Ola and Sheba drivers out there, our delivery drivers all need toilets. As I mentioned, they support public art. And if you can't access a public toilet, you know access the spaces and places that those toilets are in. Or if you get there, you're not necessarily going to be able to stay. So I've got two photos on this slide. I want you to have a look at the top one and think if you'd really like to use that one there. This is taken in a New York park. I can't say I did use these toilets, but you walk in, and if you sit down, they hide the top half of your body, but not necessarily the lower part of your body. So I'm assuming that there's been some antisocial behaviour in these toilets, and so their solution was to cut the doors in half. Maybe not the best design solution, but I'll leave that up to you. The picture down the bottom is a toilet in Beenleigh. I currently work at Logan City Council, which is East Queensland. And these are some new toilets that were located in a new sporting facility. So toilet, you can see that they've got very high doors, and there's no gap between the door. So you can't kind of look in through that to see who's in there. So there's really good visibility of these toilets. You've got the communal hand wash there. So they are, we are seeing more and more gender neutral, unisex, open for everybody toilets or user restrooms. And so design definitely can play a key role in that. What we have found is that when we start talking about user experiences, there's a lot of exclusionary design. So I've just showed you a good example from Logan, and now I'm going to show you a not so great one. So the picture with the first image there is they're wheelchair friendly toilets, excuse me, as it says on the door. But if you look a little bit closer, you'll notice that there's no pathway to get to these toilets, that they are not connected to any other space in that park. So putting a standalone infrastructure by itself is not enough. I did hear from wheelchair users who might be able to get into the toilet but couldn't necessarily shut the door behind them, or a wheelchair user who couldn't take their child to the bathroom. So we really need to look at design and how they suit all users. In the middle is a photograph of, it's called a Yuri Lift. This is designed in the Netherlands, and it's designed to combat nighttime public urination in entertainment districts, let's say. So they were finding that people were going out drinking, the clubs or the bars would shut, and then there was nowhere for people to go to the toilet, so they might be, urinating on the street. So they came up with this design. Now, during the day, it is underground, so it actually, there's a little light in there so you can see where to aim. And so it was designed this way because businesses didn't necessarily want a toilet out the front of their business all the day. But only certain people can use this. It does require certain bodily anatomy, but it also requires you to be a certain height. So it really includes some, but definitely excludes others. And the last picture we've got there is public toilets, or toilets in general, are one of the few places that we have sex segregation in our public spaces. It doesn't necessarily suit everybody. For trans and gender diverse people, there can be a lot of fear and anxiety when having to choose which toilet to use. Also, for parents that might have a child of a different gender, some challenges about at what age do we take our son or daughter into the toilet that suits our gender? Do we do it for us? Do we do it for them? Also, with people who are carers for people, deciding which toilets to use can be different. So I just ask you to think, and maybe, what's your favorite toilet and who can and can't use it? I've enjoyed having some media interviews, but every time a story comes in, I also get a lot of feedback from it. And this message was sent directly to me. And every time I read it, it really makes me reflect on why I'm interested in public toilets, but it also pulls on my heartstrings a little. So the message reads, I really want the number of changing places to be substantially increased and for them to be available everywhere like regular toilets are. How do we make this happen? I'm sick of changing my daughter, 23 years old, on public toilet floors. So there's a different type of toilet called changing places, and these are for people who have higher needs. And we don't necessarily, we do have some of them in Australia, and there is a movement to get some more of them. They have now been included in the building code, which is fantastic. But they are structure for people and their carers to really facilitate them participating in public. So what does one look like? This is a changing place in the Beanley Aquatic Centre. So you can see that there is a standard toilet bowl with the arms on the side, so they're movable. So if you are a wheelchair user, you can get in and out. But also, if you are a carer that needs to go to the toilet, there's often a screen that goes around them. So as a carer, some privacy. Being in an aquatic centre, there's also a shower in here. But what the key feature is that there is an electric hoist and a whole bench. So the bench moves height, and so it allows people to be moved from a wheelchair onto a changing table. And it really supports people's dignity as opposed to being put on a public toilet floor. Do you put their head near the toilet bowl, the head near the door? Like it's just not a nice decision that anybody has to make. Now, often talking about public toilets, I get asked what my favourite toilet is. So I'm going to give you two examples today. The first one is on the Sunshine Coast, a place called Kenilworth. The local government there put out a public tender for some public art and created this toilet. I'm calling it a tourism toilet. It was designed to attract grey nomads to visit Kenilworth, stay a little bit longer, It's near the Mary River, and so it's got some beautiful artwork on the outside. And it worked because I drove the 2 hours from Brisbane to go visit it. The second one is in Bryant's Park. Now, whether it's classified as a public toilet, it's publicly available. Bryant's Park is actually a private park in New York City. These toilets have they're air conditioned in summer and heated during winter. They have classical music playing. As you can see from the image, that there is fresh flowers. They have attendants, which is something we don't normally have here in Australia. And there's rules. So they're not necessarily accessible to the local community who might be homeless, but you can ask for menstrual products, which is great. And so had a bit of fun visiting there. So next time you're in New York, I recommend Bryant's Park. So I mentioned the Policy Impact Program. Try saying that 3 times fast. One of the key outcomes I had through that was quite a bit of media coverage, which has been really fun. It started off as an extremely nervous experience, but the first time I did a radio interview, I, took me an hour and a half sitting prior, rereading my notes. I can now, needed to be in a quiet room, all the doors were shut. I can now do a media interview between meetings at work. So, definitely got some new skills through this process. And while I haven't seen a lot of policy change, there is a conversation out there happening around toilets. And I think there is that acknowledgement people's needs aren't being met by what we currently have. So this, that's the end of my presentation today. I've got a link to my Policy Impact Program paper. I've got my contact details up there. And I do have a live poll, which I forgot to ask at the start. But for the people who are on here, are you a public toilet enthusiast? Have I convinced you that public toilets are important infrastructure that we need to spend more time thinking about? So I look forward to seeing the results from those polls. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. Are we running the polls? Okay.
Woohoo! That's a great outcome. Thanks, everyone.
So thank you, Katherine. So the results, I think you can see them. 50% said yes, they identify as a toilet enthusiast. No one said no, and 50% said, what is that? And at the end, are you a toilet enthusiast now? 75% said always was, and 25% you convinced me. So you have changed the mood of the room. We will have questions at the end, so please to the live Q&A. I see there's a couple of comments in the discussion forum, but if you've got a question, please put them in there. And I'll introduce our next speaker. So Kelly Hopewell, and I think, apologies, my video's gone off again. Her topic is sewage systems. So we're following the infrastructure. Kelly works to change our world in her role at the City of Gold Coast and as the chair of the Australian and New Zealand Biosolids Partnership. She has a degree in environmental science and Masters of Engineering practice and has worked in the water industry for over 20 years. Whilst the need to provide high quality sewage treatment has been appreciated for decades, novel and exciting technologies to provide efficient ways to produce high quality recycled water and biosolids are ever emerging. Kelly's fellowship took her to sewage treatment plants in the UK, USA, and Chile. Can we just welcome Kelly Hopewell?
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. I was very fortunate to be awarded the Churchill Fellowship in 2015. Back then, they called me the sludge lady, and I'm passionate about sewage and wastewater, as we call it. So it's fitting that I follow on from this, the brilliant talk about toilets. Thanks so much. I can't wait to go to Kenilworth and see that toilet up there. And my presentation's called Wastewater, a Resource, and I hope by the end of it you realise how valuable wastewater can be. But a little bit of history first. So the first sanitation cesspits apparently appeared 4000 BC, and the concept of hygiene was established throughout the Roman Empire. But back then, it seemed like all they wanted to do was get rid of the sewage without much treatment, put it into the local river. In the 1850s, as populations increased and moved into city centres, the treatment of the waste disposal was not actually very good. So that people would throw wastewater into the streets and into the gutters. It was causing outbreaks of different diseases, typhoid and cholera. At the time, though, they thought that the cholera was passed on by miasma, which is bad air, until Dr. John Snow came along. He's pretty much known as the first epidemiologist, and he showed that if by mapping the outbreak of cholera, that the cholera was passed on by the drinking water that was contaminated by sewage. He ended up solving the cholera outbreak in Soho in London in 1854 by just telling the council to remove the handle on the Broad Street pump. And there's still a pub there, and you can go and visit the John Snow pub in Soho to celebrate this achievement in public health. So the knowledge of sanitation and water supply meant big advancements in public health over the years. But the early treatment, and I say treatment, was really focused on just removing the easy to degrade substances and putting it in the waterways, as mentioned. Then wastewater treatment evolved to also reduce nitrogen and phosphorus. But now we can consider treatment plants as resource factories because they produce water, energy, and another product, biosolids, which I'll get into. So I work for the City of Gold Coast, as mentioned, just down the road from Logan City Council. And this is our largest treatment plant. I'll quickly go through how it works. So at the beginning on the right side of the screen here, we've got screenings and grit removal. And they had to take out things that shouldn't have even been flushed down the toilet in the first place. Things like plastics and wet wipes, toys. You'll find all sorts of things getting removed in this treatment step. Then we go to the main part of the process, which is the bioreactors, where then the nutrients are removed, and we grow up biomass, so bacteria that can remove nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon from the wastewater. Then there's a clarification step where those bacteria are settled and removed from the process, and then a disinfection step. We use chlorine at this plant. After the chlorine, the treated effluent is stored in those big lagoons in the middle here, and we release what's not used as recycled water on an outgoing tide. But the exciting part for me of sewage treatment is actually what happens to those solids, what happens to the biomass and the organics that we've grown up in those processes. And we have a process here we call anaerobic digestion, which means without oxygen. So there's special bacteria in there that can convert all of that organic matter, or a lot of the organic matter, into methane, and the methane can then be burnt to generate electricity and heat to heat the digesters. Then from there, the digested sludge is dewatered and then taken to these drying beds, and they still have a large proportion of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus in those solids. So as I said, effluent, if it's not used in parks and gardens all around the city and schools and golf courses, then it's released to the seaway on an outgoing tide. In massive big pipes, you can see there's a pipe as this large underneath the Gold Coast Broadwater. But the larger distance is what happens to our solids. So the biosolids, after they're dried and dewatered, they're taken in trucks, in large trucks, out to the Darling Downs and farms around the area. And that can be like almost a 300-kilometre trip. But they're great. They're beneficially reused, we call it, on farms as a soil conditioner because they've got such great characteristics like carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus that are just perfect for soil rehabilitation. So why did I choose to look at biosolids in my fellowship? Well, looking at a sewage treatment plant, 42% of the costs is electricity and 37% of the cost is biosolids. So almost 80% of the cost of treating sewage is in power or biosolid. In treating sewage is power or biosolids. So they're the big win. They're the big ticket items that I thought I could influence. The law of conservation of energy says energy cannot be created or destroyed, but can be converted from one form to another. And that's what we do in our sewage treatment plants. We take organic matter from biosolids through an anaerobic digestion process and then convert it to electricity and heat. There are other things that we can convert it to, like renewable. We could clean it up and put it in the gas grid, for example. And then obviously the digestate is used as an organic fertilizer. So my Poo-Tiki tour, as I called it, went through the UK, USA, and Chile, and I was looking for the most efficient way to treat wastewater and utilise the carbon that's present in biosolids. There are a few pre-treatment options, and they involve high temperature and high pressure. And the pre-treatment makes it easier for the anaerobic digesters to digest. And there's also different dewatering options. Some of them include putting more energy in to remove more water. So it's all in balance. And I was trying to look for the optimal balance that would suit our treatment plants here in Australia. I visited the UK, and I won't go into everything in each slide, but at the Oxford treatment plant, they've got this dewatering equipment that we didn't have in Australia at that time. It actually comes from the fruit juicing industry. So instead of getting the juice out of apples, we're actually squeezing the water out of biosolids. And so that's something there's a plant in Victoria that now has that technology. And I visited 2 different types of thermal hydrolysis in Oxford and Crawley treatment plants over there. Over in the US, I went to Miami-Dade, and apparently I was the first real-life Australian that this guy had ever met. So I put on a few Ocker sayings for him. They've got a rapid treatment there that they treat their biosolids. They've also got a landfill next door, so they've got a lot of spare electricity. They can use landfill gas and biogas from their digesters in their cogeneration plants. And then I went to Walt Disney World. I didn't get to see Mickey Mouse, but I did get to see where all the sewage is treated from the Walt Disney World and the nearby theme parks. They've actually got what they call harvest power that takes the sludge from the sewage treatment plant and any food waste from the local theme parks and co-digests them together, including a machine that depackages candy and puts the candy in the digesters, and the bugs love sweet foods like us. And then I went to Chile, and I've never said a sewage treatment plant is spectacular before. However, this is the view from the control room, and in the background you can hardly see it, but the Andes are in the background with snow caps on them, and yeah, it's actually a beautiful sewage treatment plant to visit. One I recommend if you ever get to Santiago. These 2 treatment plants are huge and can treat almost 7 million people's waste in these 2 treatment plants. They were put in a massive project of upgrades in the last 10 years, and they're now known as biofactories. They actually are now energy positive, and they were put in as a way to reduce the likelihood of another cholera outbreak, as what happened in 1991, where people were using raw sewage to irrigate farms. So in my spare time, after I finished my fellowship, I was asked if I'd like to chair the technical committee on the Australian and New Zealand Biosolids Partnership. And that's an industry group that looks at sustainable ways to manage biosolids. We're not the only group in the world, obviously. There's I stole this little diagram from the Northwest Biosolids in the US, and there's similar industry bodies all around the world. If we can sustainably manage biosolids, they can help us to return carbon and nutrients to the soil. They can help reduce chemical fertilizer use, which is also energy intensive to produce. They can help us produce green energy at our treatment plants, and they can help rehabilitate degraded land. We've had some great wins in New Zealand with rehabilitating mine sites. However, we also need to manage emerging contaminants, pathogens, and protect food safety if there's food crops grown on farms, and reduce odour potential. And we also have to manage perceptions of safety as well. And one of those such perceptions came about recently with the COVID response, where people were concerned that if we can detect COVID in sewage, how come we are allowed to put sewage sludge or biosolids onto land? Is that a risk? And from the scarce available information in early last year, we were able to put together a fairly convincing document that showed that the likelihood of any COVID risks in biosolids is extremely low, as we treat the biosolids for pathogen removal, and COVID is one of the ones that would be more easily respond to that treatment. And we also produced information on microplastics in biosolids. And over the last few years, we've been coming up against a problem that is society-wide about PFAS chemicals, or forever chemicals. These are chemicals you might have heard have been used in firefighting foams, and there's problems of contamination events in defence sites and around airports in the country. However, they also appear in everyday items around our home: non-stick cookware, Teflon, Scotchgard, Gore-Tex clothes, unfortunately microwave popcorn bags, and cosmetics. And traditionally, the way we would deal with contaminants would be to reduce it at the source. But because it's just in everything these days, there's a really call to arms for the water industry and the waste industry to try and reduce people importing these products. So I've stolen a little bit of information from Logan City Council. They've been very great in doing a demonstration plant. I got this from the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, ARENA website. They've found a demonstration of gasification, and it can destroy 94% of the PFAS and 60% of the microplastics. They do need to manage some of the gas, off gas from that, and they're massive biochar. So they start off with a massive biosolids, and the amount of after treatment, the amount of biochar they have to deal with and utilize is much less. And it's definitely a promising technology solution. We're very happy that the Clean Energy Regulator has just said that in their soil carbon accounting that biosolids and biochar can both be used as a way to claim carbon credits for carbon that's been implemented in soil rehabilitation programs. Could we reduce and transport emissions and use our biosolids locally? That's something we've been looking at. And Milorganite is a product made from Milwaukee's biosolids, and it's been available since 1926. And they've just come up with a shortage recently. Their demand is outpacing their production of their biosolids at that place. We've been trying to throw around a few terms. Instead of Milorganite, could we call it black gold for the Gold Coast? Or because of our surf culture, surf and turf. We also thought of GC's feces, but probably not a good one for our promoting our biosolids. And we've also looked, is there other ways to boost our biogas production? We've done preliminary tests, and we've found some promising results from milk waste, food waste, and brewery wastes. If we could increase our biogas production by importing more wastes, we could increase electricity production. And we've got to think of a few things like the import of other contaminants, but we could help both our sewers to reduce odor and corrosion and our treatment plants if we can introduce other wastes into our digesters. So there's many options for us, and there's future uncertainty about emerging contaminants, but we still need to keep improving. Our largest recent investment is a new cogeneration plant at Coombabah, and it will will be producing electricity and heat for our digesters. We've brought in new dewatering technology as well to reduce the truck movements. And in the future, we're looking at centralised facilities, so bringing more sludge into Coomera, whether we could employ some thermal hydrolysis treatments or other thermal treatment feasibility. Is there more co-digestion opportunities? And we need the ability to pivot to other technologies if regulations change. And we will continue to lobby for change for imports and education on what to flush. This is just a diagram of some wheat that was grown on biosolids amended soil, and you can see it's much better than the others. And I'll stop now and ask if there's any questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. There's been a bit of discussion in the forum. Certainly your presentation has got some interest. So we will have the questions at the end. Please put them into the live Q&A. The next speaker we have is Jorgen Gullistra. I hope I've got that right, Jorgen. Jorgen is a 2017 Churchill Fellow who travelled to Europe and the USA to investigate workplace and industry approaches to mental health and suicide prevention. Born in Denmark, he migrated to Australia in 1988 and worked on several construction sites as a plumber. After 13 years as a union official, he became the project officer on the Queensland Construction Industry Suicide Prevention Project in 2007. Which later became the Mates in Construction organisation, today operating in 2 countries, 4 states and across 3 industries. Jorgen is a qualified plumber, holds a master's degree in suicidality and received Suicide Prevention Australia's 2018 Life Award for leadership in suicide prevention. And I'm certainly aware of the Mates in Construction program in use in the industries that I'm involved in. So thank you for that. Jorgen's presentation is pre-recorded, but he will join us in the Q&A later. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here today. My name is Jorgen Gullistra, and I'm a 2017 Churchill Fellow. Obviously, this is a different conference to a past conference I've been to, being that we have COVID and have to socially isolate and can't get together and all those kind of things. It's a little bit frustrating, but it is what it is. I want to start by paying my respect to the traditional owners of the land upon where each of us are today. In my case, I'm at the land of the Turrbal people in Brisbane. I want to pay my respect to their elders, those past and present, but also those who are emerging as leaders of that community. We need to remember that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and we should respect it as such. Now, this presentation will deal with mental health and suicide prevention. I want to point to you that there will be a phone number at the bottom of each slide, and take a note of that, because if some of the stuff we talk about here resonates, perhaps when we meet virtually like we are today, it's really important to make sure that we have resources at hand. I want to acknowledge those of us who have lived experience of suicide and poor mental health, whether we have been bereaved by suicide, whether we have survived suicide, or whether we care for somebody suicidal, or having mental health conditions. Our voices matter and are important in the discussion. So I want to share my screen and then we get started on the presentation. So there, that should be it. So as I said, I'm a 2017 fellow. My area of interest is workplace mental health and suicide prevention. Now, the fellowship I had took me to France, Switzerland, Denmark, England, Sweden, United States, and New Zealand over a period of time. And I traveled in 1 February, 1 March 2018. At today's presentation, I want to go through three things. I want to talk about what led me, what was my prehistory before my backstory to my Churchill Fellowship. I want to talk about my first Churchill Fellowship and a few of the experiences I had on my way and why they were important to me. And then what the Churchill Fellowship had meant for me in my career. Now, about this place in the presentation, you might have worked out that I wasn't born in Australia. My background was I was born in Denmark. I'm a plumber by trade, and that would no doubt raise the next question is, what is the link between plumbing and mental health and suicide prevention? My story is that I hated school with a passion. And when I was about 15, I just went on strike. I didn't do my schoolwork anymore, and I didn't want to do it anymore. Mum and Dad said, you either earn or learn. So I started walking the streets until I could actually find someone who wanted to take me on as an apprentice. And I found a small company who were prepared to take me on as an apprentice plumber. So when I was 15, I was allowed to leave school. I was sort of halfway through grade 9. And I started as a plumbing apprentice in this small maintenance company in Copenhagen, Denmark. And it was the best job ever because I got to be really useful and create things and do something that had social value, got paid for it, got respected for my input. So I was really proud, it was really good. But when I was about 17, it was like sort of a haze settled upon me. I started losing interest in things and pleasure. I started drinking and drugging a lot. A lot of things started to go wrong for me. I felt like I was sort of living behind this plate of glass, that I could see the world go around me, but I couldn't feel it. I couldn't engage with it. It was like a movie. I was a passive bystander. I knew that people loved me, but I couldn't feel it. I knew that I mattered to people, but I couldn't experience it. And I got this strong feeling of guilt for not being able to be what I should be for people around me, not be able to connect with people, not be able to be the boy and the man I should be. That led me to some suicide attempts. It led me to a lot of medication. It led me to get to know the hospital systems a bit better. But my employer was a really key part in this, because for him and this small company, it would be such a disgrace for one of the apprentices not completing the apprenticeship. So every morning I would have to turn up in his office, and he would look at me and he would see whether this was one of the days where I could actually go out and face customers, or whether this was one of the days where I had to stay in the workshop where he could keep a bit of an eye on me. And during the periods where I couldn't control my alcohol, he would make sure that I took what they call antabuse to make sure that I didn't drink during work, that I could stay sober and safe. And with that effort, I got through my apprenticeship and I qualified as a plumber. I met my wife at the time and things was good. And about after 5 or 6 years, when I was about 22, 23, things started getting better. But by then I had been unwell for so long that everybody saw me through this prism of mental illness. People thought it was fantastic when I got out of bed. They didn't see me as much as a person. So I spoke to my wife and said, well, I need some fresh air. I need something to change to be able to reinvent myself as a well person so I can function well in my community. And we talked about what would that be and what would that take. And we agreed that moving to Australia would be just about far enough away from Denmark to be able to reinvent myself. So I arrived here in 1988. And I suppose I did what migrants do the best. I pointed out to everybody who wanted to listen how wrong you were in Australia and how you could do things better like we did in Denmark. And the natural progression for that was, of course, to become a union official. So I was a union official for 13 years and I got to lead one of the unions during that period of time. Now, during that period of time, I also lost several members to suicide. And I remember how helpless you could feel as an official when you went to the family, because that was your job, to say, what can the union do for you? And all we could do was organize money. We couldn't give people the answers about when and how and where, because obviously we spent more time at work often awake than we spent at home. So it was just so disempowering. And also it connected me with, this could have been my family, this could have been me. and only by the grace of God was it not. So that made me advocate for an initiative within our industry, together with other people who had similar experiences, to say we need to have a program within our industry that deals with mental health and suicide prevention. And that eventually became what was known as Mates in Construction. Now, Mates have expanded from a Queensland, Brisbane initiative to become a national initiative, to become an international initiative. We now have a branch in New Zealand. From construction, there's now Mates in Mining, Mates in Energy. So it became a bit of a movement over time of things where industries actually wanted to take control of their own mental health and suicide prevention programs and deal with it as such. Now, let me talk a bit about my fellowship. So, these are a few pictures from my travels. I brought this flag, and that became the connection between the places, that everybody signed my flag, and at the end of it, I ended up with signatures of everyone I had met on my trip, which was an amazing souvenir to have. I also created this Facebook group called Workplace Suicide Prevention. You're welcome to join it, where I blogged my travels as I went through my experiences, my thoughts. And after I came back, that grew. So this is now a little community of more than 600 members that are passionate about suicide and suicide prevention and mental health in the workplace. So during my travels, I went to 7 countries, visited 14 cities, had 53 meetings, interviewed 163 individuals, and came back with 73 hours of recordings to transcribe afterwards. Great planning, but it was fantastic. It was really good. Now, one of the most impactful experiences I had was my meeting with Pierre Bourdieu and Daniel Linhart in Paris. Now, these were 2 friends that came together in the most unusual of circumstances. Pierre was a union delegate with French Telecom, and Daniel Linhart was a sociologist at one of the universities in Paris. In the early 2000s, French Telecom became privatized. In the early 2000s, there was major changes in telecommunications, changing from analog, hardwired landline systems, more and more to mobile technology, more and more to become internet companies rather than phone communication companies. So it meant a whole heap of changes organizationally within French Telecom at this time. But they were also stuck with a public service mentality within the workforce, a very large workforce with very restrictive agreements that meant that they couldn't reassign people just like that. They couldn't have forced redundancies. They couldn't force people sack people due to the agreements they had. So management devised this strategy. The object of that strategy, the CEO expressed in a board meeting saying, I make them leave one way or another, through the window or out the door. So there were Didier Lombard at one of the board meetings that was recorded. The strategy was uncovered in a judicial investigation later into the suicides, because there was more than 35 suicides associated with that period of time in French Telecom. So there was a judicial investigation into the suicide that revealed that management put in place tactics intended to destabilize the working lives of the entire workforce and thereby push employees to leave the company voluntarily. So the type of things they would do, they would continually reassign people new tasks. So a highly qualified technical engineer dealing with the most complex business systems would be assigned to answer the phone calls from retail customers who want a new phone line. Workers would turn up at work after a weekend or after a holiday and find the workplace had moved without telling them. They would be transferred to workplaces far away from where people lived. Everybody would continue to be moved through it in a very sophisticated strategy where everybody had to have a change in position every 6 months. There was a company policy. A worker described the experience this way in a what turned out to be a suicide note to his union. He said, I could no longer bear being in this hell, spending hours in front of a screen like a mechanical puppet, faced with the determination of people who let us die like dogs. If you could speak about this or escalate it so that others know and realize that this reckless lot is prepared to do to get people to leave. Now, as I said, there was more than 35 suicides associated with this strategy. Now, the unions found it really difficult to deal with, and Deirdre explained it to me with my meeting with me, said, well, unions are designed for thinking globally, acting locally. And they found it very difficult to devise a strategy for mental health. It didn't fit within the thinking. So they thought that if they could distance themselves for it, it would be better. So they found they couldn't actually get their unions engaged with it. So Deirdre organized a group of workers within it, and they created this coalition against forced mobility and mental health. And they then paired up with key academics, and that's where Daniel Linhardt came into it, to bring them together to gather the evidence around what was actually happening. And eventually that became to the public fore, and there was a judicial investigation into it. The outcome of that was that 8 of the key executives of the company became criminally prosecuted, and the CEO of the time was faced and was convicted to 12 months prison and a significant fine, and several other executives were prosecuted as well. So it was a very powerful, very strong emotional story. They achieved good change and are more healthy, but it brought this whole idea of work-related suicide to the fore in France. And in my mind, it really brought it up to me that when we're talking about mental health at work, we're talking about something which potentially can have a fatal outcome if we don't get it right. Now, I brought that back, and I've recently been part of creating a national blueprint for mentally healthy workplaces with the National Mental Health Commission. And one of the things that's really clear is, of course, employers are not responsible for the mental health of their workers. That would be unreasonable, because there's genetic parts of that, and there's cultural parts of that, and there's social parts of that, and there's people's private lives. It's just too complex. But employers are responsible for the hazards within the workplace that impacts on people's mental health, and are responsible for mitigating the impacts of those hazards. And definitely not, like was the case in the French telecom, actually creating hazards as part of a management strategy. So through that work with the National Mental Health Commission, I was able to elevate that so that within that national strategy, there's 3 activities. But the first activity is to protect workers against hazards in the workplace. The next activity is to use the workplace for good. And the third activity is to look out for individuals. So that's what a very tangible way I could use my skills from this. Another really powerful experience I had was a meeting I had in Boston. I was talking to some people that knew I was coming, so they put together a group of industry people from the construction industry in Boston, employers and unions and academics. And there's a little group photo of that meeting. Now, at that meeting was a fellow called Sean Neely. He was an official with the Ironworkers Local 7 union. He told me his story, and that was really powerful. He worked on the tool. He had an addiction when he was young, but he became clean, and he started getting a career as an ironworker. And after a few years into to his career, he got a back injury. Now, in America, they have this system where people get their health insurance through their employer and through their employment. So Sean contacted his health insurer to get some treatment, but the health insurer wouldn't authorize an MRI because it was too expensive. But they gave him pain management and physio to deal with his back injury. Part of the system in the US is that to maintain your coverage, you have to work a minimum of 600 hours per year. So while Sean was covered for the injury he was in, if he didn't work for 600 hours, his family would lose his health cover through his lack of connection with the employer. So that meant that he had to dose up on pain medication. So he was prescribed opioids, codeine, and various kinds of opioids to manage his pain. And he would dose up so he would complete his hours and then go back and get treatment and try to get better. And it became a cat and mouse. But after several years, he finally got that MRI scan authorized. And they found that he had 2 slipped discs in his back. And by then he had to have the fuse back in order to fix it. But even then, before he could actually go and have the operation, Sean needed to go back to work to do his hours so he wouldn't lose his insurance cover during his recovery period after his operation, because he knew he would be off work to recover from the operation. So he was dosed up on pain medication. So he had his operation. He got his disc fused, and he got back to work. But by then he had a significant opioid addiction. And I became involved in the project here a little bit later that dealt with death by despair, looking at what happens in America, because a lot of things happens in America and then come to Australia a few years later. But by insight into the system, they could actually then say, well, there's significant differences between Australia and USA in the way that our health cover is provided and our connection with it, our workers' compensation systems and so on. That meant that perhaps the opioid things won't happen. We can still have other things, but this might be something that would be a different rollout in Australia. The last area was my visit to the World Health Organization and the International Labour Organization. I met Dr. Alexander Fleischmann from the World Health Organization, and I met Manal and Franklin from the International Labour Organization. For the ILO was really interesting to see the breadth of things that they were dealing with, and how mental health was really for them a first world problem, because some of the workplaces they were dealing with, say in Middle East, the workers would just disappear and die, and nobody would find them. We would only find out a month later that they had died. And nobody really cared because they were coming from different countries. So say getting mental health on that agenda would be so difficult. But also Alexander was really interested in the program I was engaged in. And what happened several years later, actually in August this year, the World Health Organization provided this Live Life Guide, an implementation guide for suicide prevention in countries, and featured mates in construction as an example of world's best practice for suicide prevention and mental health globally, and what governments should take upon themselves to do to get good practice. So this is an example where a little program in Australia, through this Churchill Fellowship and through the connections made, actually made it onto the world stage as something we can be proud of. So what it meant to me at my career, it's given me an international network, and that meant that I've done keynotes in keynote speech in Canada, India, and New Zealand. I now collaborate in projects in St. Louis in USA, in St. John in Canada, in New Zealand. It gave me the confidence to go back to study, although I didn't finish grade 9. I'm now doing my PhD, and I've been doing that since February 2020, and have been confirmed now, and I'm researching male help offering in suicide prevention. And it's broadened my practice towards mental health more generally. I've left mates in construction now. I now have the Signage and Consultation, helping different organizations, businesses, and charities establishing mental health programs from a lived experience informed paradigm. And I do suicide prevention more generally, not just workplaces. I've been working with architects and different people to really have a much broader prism overlaying mental health and suicide prevention. So that's my presentation. I would really appreciate if you could take a photo of this QR code and give me a bit of feedback, because I like to keep trying to improve what I deliver. My contact details are there if you want to know more. Fantastic to be part of today. Thanks.
Thank you, Jorgen. That was an amazing presentation. There's quite a lot of chat, discussion forum. Please put your questions in for Jorgen, and we'll move on to them at the end of this session. So our fourth speaker is Zoe Ether, and her subject is smart community. Zoe Ether is an untraditional engineer, a millennial and a Winston Churchill Fellow with a passion for smart cities, smart communities, and smart regions. This is not just in the big cities, but using technology of thinking as enablers to make the places we live more accessible, livable, and sustainable for all. Zoe is determined to not do things the way we've always done them. Her engineering mind and unique background allow her to critically analyse her experiences and draw practical conclusions for the future. Zoe keeps up to date with the latest trends and shares her learnings through hosting the Smart Community podcast, as well as managing her own boutique consultancy, My Smart Community. And you can see these 4 presentations weave together exceptionally well. Please welcome Zoe Ether.
Thank you very much, Leeanne. So it's 2019. I'm on my Winston Churchill Fellowship. I happen to be in Amsterdam. I'm at a circular economy event. We are in this beautiful building looking out over the canal. It's around sunset, so the light's streaming in. And I'm talking to some amazingly passionate people. And I'm telling them about my Winston Churchill Fellowship, that I'm traveling to 9 countries in 9 weeks, telling them about where I've been and where I'm going. And I mentioned that I had been to Mexico City. And one guy who looked a bit like Hugh Jackman, actually, about mid-40s, but he had these like round glasses. And he pipes up, "Oh, do you know what the biggest problem the Mexican government was having with the metro?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't know." He said, "Oh, it only affects women." And I went, "Oh, I don't know, safety, I guess." And he said, "Well, yes, but maybe not in the way that you're thinking." And I said, "Okay, tell me more, I'm intrigued." He said they were having this really big problem with women giving birth on the floor of the train carriages. And I was like, oh my goodness, these poor women, they're trying to get to the hospital with the metro as their only option. You know, there's delays, there's overcrowding, and of course, babies just come whenever they're ready. And he said, well, the government thought that as well, but it was just happening so regularly that they had to investigate. They had to look at the data and they had to ask the women involved. So they did that. And it turns out that the women were actually choosing to go to the metro, to the station, when they were due to give birth. And I was thinking, why would anyone possibly want to do that? Now, when you buy your ticket for the metro, it's only a couple of pesos, not very expensive at all. You also get health insurance for the duration of your journey. And I thought, wow, these women are so smart. So what did the government do about this? I thought, well, they could have, changed the policy, sent the women away. But according to my Dutch friend, who looks a bit like Hugh Jackman or George Clooney, one of them, he said that actually they didn't do any of that. They put midwives and nurses to the train carriages to ensure everyone a safe journey. And I thought, wow, the future of transport, meeting the real needs of our community. Now, of course, I wanted to find out more about this story, look at the data involved, do my usual fact check. But do you think I could find anything on it? No, absolutely nothing. So I couldn't put it as a case study in my Churchill Fellowship. But it really got me thinking, that even if it's not 100% accurate, the message still stands true. When you start talking about the real needs of the community, you have very different conversations about the future than you had in the past. The future of our communities is actually about meeting the real needs of them. So before I move on, I would also like to do an acknowledgement of country, and I'm on the Yagara and Turrbal people today, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Now, the term smart city is quite a popular one, but it's one that I don't use very often because I realize that it's not as inclusive as it could be, and it can actually be quite polarizing, particularly for people in regional areas. So I shifted my language just before I went on my fellowship, actually, to smart community. So I do whatever it takes to shift that smart city conversation to be a smart community one. So instead of leading with technology, we actually lead with people and how we can solve real problems for real people in real communities, including people in communities that may not be in the big city. So I work with government, industry, and regulatory authorities to help them to build communities that are accessible, livable, and sustainable for all. So this means not just looking at the people that are already doing well, making their lives better with an autonomous vehicle, but it actually means looking at the ways we can increase the quality of life for people that may not have the same level of access to services right now, and explore if technology and data can help us to serve those people better. Now, some might say we don't need any of this advanced technology to make our lives better, that we should just keep doing it the way we've always done it. But the problem is disruption is just that, disrupting. And change is coming whether we like it or not. Change is coming whether we are involved or not. It doesn't matter what industry you're in, it doesn't matter where you live, where you work, where you play. Disruption is coming and it's going to affect all of us. Now, it's not about technology for the sake of it, so not tech for tech's sake, but rather choosing what we need to solve real problems. Also banging on a bit more about the word community, it really means people to me, and people automatically think about this when we say community. It has a really strong connotation on integration, and also inbuilt into the idea of community is collaboration and connection. And it makes a lot more sense than city to me when we're trying to engage with people, because you can have smart communities wherever you are, and wherever you're going as well. And so the community can really join us along the journey. The other thing we need to realize is that communities are already smart because they have so many insights that they can provide. We just need some tools and things in place so then we can actually capture that, so that we can make better decisions for everyone in our community and take advantage of the positive opportunities that tech and data can bring our way, but also have enough knowledge to ask questions about, just because we can, should we? It's about inviting people in so that they can contribute their smarts to their community. Okay, I'm going to go back just a little bit. You might see a mates in construction thing there, and I was actually a mates in construction connector, and I was a mates in construction assist worker. So thank you, Jorgen. I really enjoyed your presentation. So I grew up on the outskirts of Roma. I'm an engineer, traditionally in civil and environmental. I started working in hydraulics, didn't like that, really wanted to get out on site. So I ended up working across regional Queensland, and I came to Toowoomba, where I live now, to work on a really big construction project. But I really wanted to work overseas. Now, seemingly as soon as that thought entered my head, an email landed in my inbox. It was from our Director General at the time when I was working at Transport and Main Roads, Queensland Government. And our Director General had just gone to South Korea and was really excited about the technology. And he wanted to send one of his engineers over there. So fortunately, I applied for that opportunity and was successful. So I lived and worked in South Korea for 3 months. And this is where I was immersed in this, back then, the smart city concept. Now, when I came back to Australia, I got a job in the Cooperative and Automated Vehicle Initiative. In other words, self-driving cars. But I was really obsessed with this smart city thing back in the day, and it wouldn't leave me alone. So I decided that I needed more people to talk to. So I started a podcast to give me the platform to continue to learn, but also build that community. And as I said, to give me more people to talk to. Now, it turns out you can't have a podcast and be a public servant. Oh, here's some photos of me in Korea. Here's the Cabby project. You can't be a public servant and have a podcast at the same time. So I left my good, secure government job to start this podcast that didn't pay me any money. And because you can't eat passion forever, I started my own consultancy. And we really focus on taking the overwhelm out of this smart conversation, particularly in communities outside the big cities. So since then, I've been working with government and industry in this space, from high level strategic work to on the ground implementation. Now, this was around April 2018. It was a really busy month. I really don't know how I did it all. But anyway, I also applied for a Winston Churchill Fellowship at the same time. And fortunately, otherwise I would not be here today, I was successful in that. And I was looking at smart mobility. So my background in transport combined with smart communities. So I went to 9 countries in 9 weeks. And I was researching smart mobility and how we can integrate that into our communities. Now, I found that there was some really big global issues. So we had everyone's talking about congestion, pollution, population growth, and again, in cities, and it's different in regional areas. And also the lack of public transport connections as well was a really big issue, particularly in regional areas. Now, the other thing everyone was talking about is what I call the WTF. What's the future? Is it autonomous vehicles? Is it electric vehicles? Is it a combination of both? This screenshot here is from my city mapper in Barcelona when I could choose an option to catapult to my destination. Of course, a joke, not work. I didn't select that option at the time. Now, everyone's talking about all these things, right? But what was missing from the conversation? And this is what I focused my report on. So these 7 key areas were what I saw were missing from this big global conversation about smart mobility or the future of transport. So mobility as a system, the status of mobility, increasing convenient mobility, regional mobility, mobility for whom, holistic mobility, and sustainable mobility. So we'll just run through each of those. Now, there's a big topic around at the moment called mobility as a service, which is a subscription-based model to transport. So you can have all of your transport options in one place and you can pay for it in an integrated system. Now, that's great. However, you actually need the system below this, the mobility as a system. So you need connected, accessible, safe, reliable, and affordable transport options for everyone so they can actually use a mobility as a service subscription. So this first one is about actually integrating that system first. And we can think about this as better distribution of government services as well. So not just your traditional public transport and maybe rideshare and those type of things, which actually were quite up and coming when I went on my fellowship in 2019. But actually, what are these other things that are available? Maybe it's a local community bus that goes to and from a school or a hospital, that type of thing. These are all part of our mobility system. And then the governance part of it as well. These are potentially systems that aren't integrated. So how do we actually bring them together and so that everyone can access them as they need to? The status of mobility. This is about setting up the baseline. So we're just talking about, different systems or different transport services available. How can we actually understand what is available for each community member? So this is about gathering that baseline data, because if you do that, you can actually identify the real and perceived gaps, because maybe it's a perceived gap. Maybe people have never tried the system that is available to them, or they don't know it's available, so the information is not available. That's a really big issue. And then when you have this baseline, you can actually measure the impacts, because otherwise we're just guessing, oh yes, that worked or that didn't work. So we really need that baseline first. Increasing convenient mobility. Now, this was before COVID, right? So this one actually, which seems beyond crazy now, but was a bit of a controversial one, actually reducing the need to travel and remote working and really pushing that that thought. And I know remote working isn't necessarily a new thing, and it wasn't really in 2019 either, but it really wasn't an acceptable mainstream thing to be doing, which seems wild in this day and age. But this was a really key one and one of my favorite ones. And I took this photo when I was in Orlando, actually, when I was working hard and eating cake or something like that, and drinking coffee, of course. Now, the other thing about increasing convenient mobility is if we reduce that need for travel, you spend more time in the place where you live, as in, places around your house and that type of thing. So we want to actually create places for living rather than things that you just move through or places that you just move through. And thinking about the different land uses and development that we want in kind of hubs, so we can reduce that need to travel to the CBD, for example. The next one is regional mobility. Obviously, you've heard it's one close to my heart, and I'm just talking about those hubs and connectivity. We need to be able to, if we're creating these hubs, we need people to be able to get to them in a sustainable fashion. So how can we reduce that need for cars in regional areas, which is, a big challenge. Living in one myself, I know people love their cars. but it's actually about rethinking public transport and policy. So maybe it isn't just a 14-meter bus traveling around empty half the day, at hourly intervals. Maybe it is on-demand public transport, smaller buses or smaller vehicles. And how do we make sure that that's equitable for everybody, and particularly in regional areas as well, where the density may not be there. So there's a whole bunch of things we can think about here. The next one is mobility for whom. So changing how we plan and whom we actually plan for. Now, this is a really big one to think about increasing accessibility. So it's not somebody that, they have access to, maybe they can walk, maybe they have the income to be able to change modes really quickly. For example, when I was traveling around, if it was nighttime, I would change modes from public transport if I didn't feel safe, for example, to say a ride share or something like that. But that's because I had the means to be able to do that. Not everyone has the means to be able to do that. So really thinking about that is really important. And then listening to those unheard voices, the ones that aren't involved in these conversations. But that's who we're actually planning for, because if we're planning for people with the most at stake, if we don't get this right, then everybody benefits. And we can provide access to people that didn't have access before. So these are new customers to our transport network, which is so key and can be transformational for people's lives. Holistic mobility. So this is about sharing data across disciplines, obviously with privacy and security really being front of mind and designed in from the very, very, very beginning. Such a key one. But actually we're sharing data so we can solve real challenges, because we know that we don't just travel for the sake of it. We're going to and from employment. We're going to access education, to access healthcare, to life-saving services. So travel is not, mobility or transport isn't something we do in isolation. It's connected in so many different ways. So we want to be able to share data across disciplines so we can actually start to address some of these big wicked problems that we haven't been able to solve before. So this is about integrating those government services and actually bringing the customer to the center, and not the customer then having to work out all the different services they need and going, okay, well, I go here to get this, I go here to get this, but actually I have a need. How does the government work around me to serve me and provide me with that service? And a whole bunch of different services, because we need so many different services in every day of our lives. The last one here is about sustainable mobility. So this is sustainability in all senses of the word, obviously environmental, but also from the social perspective, making sure that we're serving the needs of the people, but also economic, because if services aren't sustainable, then they no longer exist. And that may not mean that everything has to be profitable. Government public transport isn't necessarily profitable across the world. But actually, how do we ensure that things just don't disappear when people start to rely on them? That's really, really important. So trials and pilots and things are really, really useful to get information and learnings and then build on that. But how do we ensure that when people are relying on these things, the people with the most at stake, that they don't just get taken away and that option is removed from them. So really thinking about scalability is so key. And actually sharing these learnings across government around the world, because these learnings can be, and obviously each place will have their own unique characteristics, but there's common threads that we can share across the world, and it's really important. And then from a whole of life cycle decision making, circular economy. So thinking about that in a transport sense, materials that we're using, but also as we were talking about earlier, making sure that services are continually around, and we're thinking about that from the very beginning. But then things like battery life, end of life of batteries rather. So if we're going more electric, how do we actually ensure that these decisions that we're making at the end of their life aren't more detrimental to the environment? So from my report, I developed this concept called the future proof. So how do you actually build a smart community? You can see smart community down the bottom there. In the middle, we've got strong leadership, we've got smart governance, accessible and sustainable network, data-driven decisions, community co-creation, and a regional approach and connectivity. So what I did is I looked at the global issues and took all these things we aren't talking about enough and put this into this model, which is how we can future-proof ourselves and our communities to be ones that are going to be smart. This next one is the way to go framework. So taking that model, how do you actually do this? And so I made this for local government. not necessarily local government, or levels of government, depending on the region, but can be applied across the world. And I've been updating this ever since. This is the original, but have been using this in my work and have been continuing to update. But if we start in the middle there, you've got smart community, and you look at your vision. What is the problem that we're trying to solve? That is such a key one, and you think it's fairly obvious, but sometimes it's not. It's I just want a checklist of technology, but actually, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And if we can't answer that question, we need to rethink why we're doing something. Then look at the data. So what data do we already have available? What do we need to collect? Do we need to create more data, etc. And then the actions, actually taking the action based on the data, and then we go back around again and start with our vision. Are we still meeting our vision? Now, around the outside, we've got the things that make it a little bit different. And if we want communities that are better than the ones we have now, or improve quality of life for people, we need to do things a bit differently. So the first one at the top is different heads. So how do we ensure that we include the unheard voices, both at the decision-making table, but also in our engagement with the community? And thinking about a regional approach, bringing regional people into the conversation, and that it's not just about one discipline. It's not just about transport planners or engineers or technology folk. It's about so many different things that need to be included in this space, because we know mobility affects so many different areas of our lives. The other one I've got there is digital diversity. So this means we want people that can understand the technology and data at that decision-making table when we are making these decisions, so they can ask the hard questions. Ones like, just because we can, should we? But also understanding the capability of the tech, understanding what data we do need to collect, what analysis we need to do. Now, the next one is headspace. So this is about having a separate arm away from business as usual. This isn't necessarily an approach that everybody takes, but from my research, this seemed to really build momentum for agencies that were able to do this, because you give people the authority to be able to actually make real decisions and real change. For whom, continuing to ask for whom, and bringing the community along the journey, and so they feel empowered to be able to do something different. Now, in the driver's seat, this is the government. The government is in the driver's seat. You've got transparent decision making. We want the government to be able to set the rules of play, and that we're using public funds for a public good, and that we have adaptive policy across and regulation across the industry. But the government can't do it alone. We need better than one, so more heads are better than one. And so we need strong partnerships with the private sector, but also academia, the community, different groups, not-for-profit sector. So many people are involved in this area. And we want an active community, and particularly thinking about how we can make procurement really accessible for people. The next one is wholesome, so thinking about that whole of life, the whole of life cycle, as we discussed before, but also about joined up government services, that it's a whole, it's not disjointed, it's not silos, we're actually thinking as a system. And the last one, my favorite, it's data time, because there's always data. Data has to be involved in this conversation, because we need to be able to measure and monitor what we're doing is right, or is improving quality of life, not decreasing it, or even thinking about the different groups that it may change things for. Privacy and security must be front of mind in this discussion. It's absolutely paramount. We are not collecting data so we can, track people or individuals. It's actually about how can an individual have more information about the city or the region or the community that they're in, so they can make better decisions, not the other way around. The last thing here from my report was this is just an extract from it, is the conversational journey plan. So when we're actually setting up these projects, these are just some of the questions we need to continue to ask. And it's amazing if you just ask the question, you get people to really think differently. So do we understand the data? Who are we planning for? Do we have mobility as a system? Have we considered privacy and security, as I bang on about quite regularly? Is the network physically and digitally integrated? Smart governance, those type of things. And a really important one, which we miss a lot, is, are we sharing our stories and learnings? Because that's so key, because it's not just about us and our community, it's about how can we share that across our global community. So I'll just finish on a little project, not a little project, quite a big project that I was working on, which was a very traditional public transport project. But they knew that they needed to, if the project was to be successful, because it was to come online in 2026, that they needed to plan for digital technology and smart community concepts. So we were engaged, I was contracted to Arup to build this strategy to be developed now and to be baked into the traditional planning, design, and business case process. Now, doing this now really allowed digital to be implemented from the very beginning and actually be, we were thinking about these projects and initiatives, and then real things happened and the design really changed. And so this was one of the first times where we actually, where I saw a shift in the industry based on the work that we've been doing, to actually bake this in from the very beginning. And I think we're going to see, I know we're going to see more and more of this, because people realize now that digital is not just an add-on. It's not just some checklist thing that we need for later. It's so important because it is involved in all of our lives right now. But we can use it to our advantage. And if we can start thinking about this in the early stages of traditional projects, because they're no longer separate from smart projects or digital projects. You don't want smart projects to be sitting over here and everything else over here. We know it's integrated now. So we know that we can really connect digital throughout the whole process. So we need designers, engineers, professionals, communities to be embedding these approaches from the very beginning. And it's also important that we plan out what is required and desired, because not every community will be the same, and the technology and data must have a use and must have a purpose. So it really has to reflect that. So smart communities start wherever they are, and they'll continue to build momentum by solving real problems for the community. And being smart doesn't start with technology. It starts with focusing in on our community's needs and discovering what is possible by not doing things the way we've always done them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zoe. Stimulating presentation. So we do have some questions already in the Q&A. I please encourage everyone to start putting your questions in there. We have almost 20 minutes to run through the Q&A. Starting back in the presentation, Michael Power has asked a question. Great to see the awareness of needs of everyone in the community being raised. Creativity in design. What would be the next step in councils and other organisations creating different types of toilets in the community? Is it legislation or is it something else? And that's for Katherine initially.
I think that's a great question, and I didn't necessarily include my recommendations in my presentation. So the first one I think is we really need to change the perception of public, because they're often seen as they're no one's responsibility, and not many people hold public toilets in high regard. So I think that's why I spend so much time trying to convince other people to become public toilet enthusiasts. We don't have legislation that delegates responsibility for public toilet provision to any one person or profession or even level of government. So often local governments will provide public toilets, but there's nothing in the legislation that says they have to. Now, Wales did create some public toilet legislation. Governments need to do assessments of their local communities and identify what their needs are. And I think that would be fantastic if we had something similar in Australia. One of my recommendations for the policy impact paper, and I feel it's a bit cheeky, is that all federally funded infrastructure projects should include a public toilet needs assessment. So you're building a new major road, where are the public toilets along that road? New bridges, anything that the community is going to be using, people are going to need to go to the toilet. So I think that was kind of one of the key. I did also create some public toilet principles, and if I can be cheeky and share my screen really quickly. Yep, the right screen's up there. So have got kind of 12 principles, which I think, similar is like we really need to consider the needs of people. A a lot of it is around that communication and talking to people and consultation. So I'm not the best person to say what a wheelchair user needs, but the standards that are out there aren't the best either. So I think, you know, this idea of how I've been trying to articulate how we can improve public toilets. So number one, acknowledge that access to toilets are part of a city, a part of our community, and they are important. They are important for public health and hygiene. Safety and privacy really need to be considered. There's a lot of different uses for public toilets, so we can't just, we need to consider all those different uses. So that's the functionality, but then accessibility. A couple I haven't had is how visually impaired people use public toilets. I think also, inclusion links very closely accessibility, the location and availability. Where are they? When are they open? Often they're closed from sunset to sunrise. Great. The attractiveness, how pretty they are, how pretty they're not, really connecting them in with the place that they are, and then also looking at how we connect them to the people who need to maintain them and the sustainability of them, signage and consultation. So there's some of my thoughts. I'm happy to receive feedback on those and have a bit of a conversation.
Thanks for that one, Katherine. I just wanted to throw that to some of our other speakers in a slightly different way, but just the connection between community needs, which I think has come through every presentation, and where someone thinks regulation needs to be part of the solution. So Kelly, I can see with the biosolids, that's relevant to you. Is there a need for something to change, or is it communication or consultation with community, or is it all happening?
Yeah, so the Australian-New Zealand Biosolids Partnership is heavily involved in ensuring that the regulations are adequate for biosolids, for example. However, there's still state-based regulations, and biosolids are produced in every state. Surely it should be a federally regulated product. And it has, each state has slightly different regulations. It is unusual that we would be regulating a federal issue state in each state, but I think it comes from each environmental regulator is a state-based organisation. When it comes to things like emerging contaminants, however, that's a countrywide issue. We're importing products that contain these forever chemicals, and we don't know about it because it's not on any labels. It's in foundations in mascara, which I surely can't imagine being an essential use. So there's definitely a need for change in some areas. In other areas, I think the states have got it covered. Yeah.
Thanks for that. And I have seen, there is nationally, it's always difficult, but there have been some wins, and certainly waste and plastics, part of that was driven by we can't export our waste anymore for some of it, but there does need to be some ability to do that. Zoe, same question really, is the regulation change needed, but also I think adding on to that, you made a point about data-driven decisions, so maybe a comment on the decision makers, and I'm assuming a lot of it is government, maybe state government. Can you just talk about that?
Sure thing. Yeah, it's a really key one, and it's kind of the way I pulled it in was in the in the driver's seat. So it's really important for government to be in the driver's seat. Traditionally, regulation lags behind, and I know that's not just in the technology sector, but technology is just moving at such a rapid pace. We actually need a fundamental shift, a seismic shift in how regulation can address technology and data and privacy to continue to protect our communities. Particularly, you know, we talk a lot about privacy and thinking about that in the way of we're talking about, you know, oh, well, now but you're also talking about all this data we need to collect. So how aren't they, you know, two conflicting things? We think about open data and is that conflicting with privacy? But the reason we need the regulation is because it's a needs to know basis. We need to know that people are moving around. We don't necessarily need to know who those people are. We don't need to know that Zoe goes here or there, or Katherine goes from this public toilet to the next one because they're the prettiest. But we want to know that that there is connection. And talking about Katherine's presentation earlier, that, you know, you plonk a public toilet in the middle of you know, an accessible toilet, but you can't actually access it because there's no footpaths, is wild. But it happens a lot in the technology space as well. We get these white elephants of these systems and things that, you know, aren't very useful to anybody, but they are big data collecting machines, and we're not aware of where our data is and how it is spread throughout the internet. So I think tech and data have done a lot of good in the world, but they've also done a lot of bad. And I think we need to be able to lean on regulation, and regulation that actually our needs to protect the people with the most at stake. And that is up to the government to do. But then working with the private sector as well, because we know that they hold, you know, petabytes and petabytes and petabytes of data about us. And we need to really think about, well, what do we need to use this data for? And continuing to ask those questions of, just because we can, should we? And again, it's the role of the government to put the public needs, not the profit of the private companies, first. So the public needs first. So regulation plays a huge role in that. But also on the flip side, sorry, I'm flipping around here, but data can really help us make better use of our resources, particularly our local government level. And I think there's going to come a time where it will no longer be good enough that we're wasting resources just because we haven't got our we don't understand the data, or we don't understand the systems and things that are in place. So regulations are also innovation as well, which may seem like an oxymoron, but actually it may, if regulation comes in to say, oh, actually we really need to take control of this, because we know data is being collected right now. This is not new stuff, right? We know all these things are in place, but how we make them more secure, and also use them for decision-making purposes as well.
Thanks, Zoe. Now, I can't see Jorgen, but I believe he can speak. Jorgen, can you speak? I'll answer your question, which is also in the Q&A.
I can see myself.
I can see you.
Okay, can you just say something? Say hi, Leeanne.
Hi, Leeanne. Hello,
Can you
Leeanne.
hear Jorgen?
We can hear.
Okay, it's just me. I'm having trouble. So I'll ask a question and you guys can respond that you've heard it. So firstly, thanks for your important work. We had an overwhelming amount of discussion, both in the presenter chat and the discussion forum. Amanda McHugh works with Defence, and there is a recognition that often the first people to see the signs of poor mental health are family members. Is there a family component to the MATES program to help families reach out on behalf of their worker and or to support families?
All the MATE services are available for families as well as workers and next of kin, and so there's lots of people reaching in that way. But it actually means suicide prevention should not just be a workplace issue; it should also be a community issue, and it really comes in with the discussion we've had more broadly here today about actually having a wider view of how we provide services and how we deal with things within the community. So in terms of a workplace program, the MATES is focusing on the workplace because that's a framework for where we access workers. But all the principles that are used are universal principles that are applicable just as well outside. The key principles behind MATES is a program called Living Works, which is a community resource that was just taken and appropriated for a workplace setting. So the answer is MATES don't have specifically outreach programs for families, but mates is available to families as well as it is for everything else. But often what happens is people actually take the mates tools with them to their sports clubs, to their churches, to their communities, and everything else around them, because all the tools are universal. It all should work together, and there should be a level of universality to it. If that, I don't know whether that answers the question.
Oh, Leeanne, Jorgen's finished now.
Thank you. Sorry, I can't hear you there, but I can see people nodding. So
It was brilliant.
and I was going to ask you, Jorgen, I heard with the USA insurance story, but I have worked in the US and I can exactly see that happening. Are there any structural issues here or any regulation changes that we need? I know we have industrial manslaughter. I think in Australia, it's people who are deliberately not wanting people to be safe, but maybe a quick comment on that.
I think in terms of suicide prevention, Australia has moved massively ahead over the last 4 or 5 years in terms of actually becoming more mature about it. We have seen it as an exclusive health problem up until about quite recently, where we actually now talk about an all of government approach, an all of community approach, baking it in at all different levels of government. We're talking about doing suicide prevention as part of infrastructure, doing suicide prevention as part of architecture, doing it in workplaces. So it is a much more wider issue because people are connected in so many different ways and so many different forms. So I think it's really an issue that we need to deal with much wider than we perhaps have done in the past. Structurally, the US system was obviously is unique, and there's no direct, like we're lucky in a lot of ways that we have a universal health system, that we have good workers' compensation system. But one of the things that are happening now is that because of that all of government approach, for instance, there's now state governments are having codes of practices around the psychosocial work environment to say that it is actually a workplace health and safety issue as well as it is a good HR issue, like a good HR activity to do. You also should be doing it because it's a law.
Thank you. We've got about 3 minutes left, so please put any last questions in the Q&A box. But I will ask one, anyone that wants to answer. I'm interested in when you took off on your Churchill Fellowship, how much was planned and how much was emergent? Just a personal development story, and did you follow the adventure?
I can start if you want. I planned a lot. Had lots of stops along the way, but I did when something came up. So it didn't have as good a ring to it. 9 countries, 9 weeks. I actually did 10 countries. I just popped over to Denmark as well because the opportunity came up, and then popped over to Sweden on the train for lunch, which was wild to an Australian that you could pop to another country for lunch. But also I continued to build my itinerary along the way when I met new people. And Katherine and I actually caught up in London, which was awesome. And we looked at public toilets, of course, because that's all we did. That's all we talk about. That's all Katherine talks about, toilets. But no, it was really, I kind of built, I definitely had a big plan, and I knew where I was going, but built up along the way as well.
And one of my highlights, other than the gin bar that Zoe and I met at, was someone suggested going to Crossness Pump Station, which is sewage system that was built in London. It was not necessarily relevant, but I got a private tour and took some beautiful pictures of this, the first sewage system. Kelly, I can share my photos with you and swap stories.
So jealous.
I found I had it 100.
We've just got 1 minute left, and we are going to finish on time because there'll be an announcement afterwards. So I suppose my last question is, we've had COVID that's changed the world. We've also just signed up in Queensland here to the Olympics, and I think there's an underlying community infrastructure, A lot of things are changing. So we've got 40 seconds. One person can answer. Is there something we need to do as a legacy?
Kelly or Jorgen?
Kelly?
That's a tough one. Put me on the spot for the last 22 seconds. I think all of the great work that everyone's doing, and every Churchill Fellow that goes overseas brings back something new. So I think there's a lot to be done, but it's exciting times, lots of changes, and there's great work to be completed in the next little while.
Fantastically done. Thank you, everyone, very much.